Today's episode begins Season 3 of Plants of the Gods with a look at one of the oldest documented hallucinogens, peyote, the sacred cactus. From William James to Richard Schultes to Aldous Huxley to Jim Morrison, peyote has had a profound impact on the psychedelic revolution. Follow ethnobotanist Dr. Mark Plotkin as he chronicles the untold history of this powerful psychedelic.
Welcome back to Season 3 of Plants of the Gods, Hallucinogens, Healing, Culture, and Conservation. I'm Mark Plotkin, Dr. Mark Plotkin of the Amazon Conservation Team. In this season, we'll cover a wide range of topics, everything from absinthe to Amanita muscaria, Richard Schultes' role in the documentation of peyote, and the strange case of Carlos Castaneda. Today, I want to focus on what might be the oldest documented hallucinogen known, peyote from the peyote cactus. This is the first hallucinogenic plant studied by my mentor Schultes, and I'll detail his research on this magic cactus in the next episode. I will say that Schultes told me after one night in the teepee with the Kiowa peoples in a ceremony led by the Kiowa roadman, that is the shaman, he was lost to medical science forever, deciding to pursue a career on the path of hallucinogenic plants, and it was peyote that set him on that path. Not only is peyote the oldest documented hallucinogen, but it has also inspired the most extraordinary descriptions of its effects on the eyes, the mind, the heart, and the soul. Let me share my favorite quote from a Huichol shaman in Mexico. Quote, "Speak to the peyote with your hearts, with your thoughts, and the peyote sees your heart. And if you have luck, you'll hear things and receive things that are invisible to others, but that God has given you to pursue your path." As I said, peyote has been in use as long or longer than just about any other hallucinogenic plant known. The Shumla Caves near the Rio Grande in southwest Texas have yielded peyote specimens dated to about 6,000 years old. Other plants of the gods, other fungi, may have been in use as long or even longer, but this is the oldest documented evidence. We therefore must consider peyote to be one of the seminal plants that introduced our species to the wonder and wonderment of these mind-altering substances. According to my colleague Keeper Trout, a leading authority on peyote, the name comes from the Aztec word peyotl, which means woolly, in reference to the woolly tufts atop the cactus. Peyote is native to Mexico and just over the border into adjacent southwestern Texas. It is a slow-growing and seemingly innocuous small and spherical cactus with a deep taproot. The crown of the cactus, that is, the spherical head above ground, is sliced and dried into what are called mescal buttons, which is why peyote is sometimes known as mescal. The peyote cactus contains more than 30 alkaloids. Remember that in a previous episode, I explained that alkaloids are a class of nitrogen-containing chemicals and that most of the hallucinogens we've discussed in Plants of the Gods are in fact alkaloids. The most prevalent of these alkaloids in peyote is mescaline, derived from the name mescal, and that in turn was derived from the Mescalero Apache peoples, who were some of the first users of the magic cactus. Hordenine and anhalidine are two other alkaloids found in peyote, but mescaline is by far the most common. Research has shown that the effects of mescaline are different from the actions of peyote taken as a whole because, in the latter, you're getting the synergistic reaction of the other alkaloids and possibly effects of the other non-alkaloidal substances as well. That contributes to the difference in visions and maybe even the healing process itself. And as so often the case in these indigenous recipes, whether the curare arrow poison we talked about in Season 1, or with other hallucinogens, the other compounds, the other alkaloids, the other admixtures, that is, the compounds mixed in by the shamans, can have very strong and very different effects. For example, the ayahuasca shamans, the so-called taitas of the Colombian Amazon, may add hallucinogenic datura leaves to the brew to treat particularly intractable emotional ailments. What that means is that when you take peyote, you're ingesting mescaline plus other compounds, whereas often in some of the early studies in the laboratory at least, people simply ingested pure mescaline. The British writer Aldous Huxley is believed by many to have launched the so-called Psychedelic Renaissance with the 1954 publication of his famous book, The Doors of Perception. What many overlook is that Huxley was launched onto the psychedelic road by taking mescaline, not peyote. Mescaline is in fact known to account for 30% of all the alkaloids found in the cactus, which is an extremely high percentage. The traditional dose in indigenous ceremonies typically ranges from as few as 2 to as many as 30 peyote buttons. The dose has a direct impact on the intensity of the experience and the visual hallucinations. These begin a couple of hours later that can be accompanied by severe nausea, to which I can personally attest. The typical dose ranges from 2 to 30 buttons, as I said, and the visual hallucinations commence shortly thereafter. However, you also are getting the effects of what are known as synesthesia, that is, hallucinations in other tactile and olfactory and auditory senses. So you're essentially tripping in 5 different senses. Peyote was first studied in the lab as early as June 1887, when John Briggs, a physician in Texas, sent specimens of peyote to the pharmaceutical lab of Park Davis in Detroit. The researchers found mescaline, which I believe was the first report of alkaloids being found in cacti. Subsequent important research on peyote was carried out by a series of extraordinary European scientists like Louis Lewin, Arthur Hefter, and Karl Lumholtz. This history is recounted in Mike Jay's wonderful book, Mescaline, A Global History, which I highly recommend. Even William James, known as the father of American psychology, experimented with peyote in the 19th century, and in so doing, launched the study of hallucinogens at Harvard, which we'll cover in an upcoming episode later in Season 3. As I said, though, of all the literature on hallucinogens, peyote has inspired the most evocative writing in terms of describing the experience. In speaking about the effect of peyote on Western scientists, let me share 2 gems. The British art critic, physician, and sexologist Havelock Ellis described the visions after taking the cactus. Quote, "First there was merely a vague play of light and shade, which suggested pictures but never made them. Then, in the course of the evening, they became distinct, but still indescribable, mostly a vast field of golden jewels, studded with red and green stones ever-changing. I'd see thick, glorious fields of jewels, solitary or clustered, sometimes brilliant and sparkling, sometimes with a dull, rich glow. Then they would spring up into flower-like shapes beneath my gaze, and then seem to turn into gorgeous, gorgeous butterfly forms, or endless folds of glistening, iridescent, fibrous wings of wonderful insects. Most usually, there was a combination of rich, sober color with jewels like points of brilliant hue." A similarly striking account was recorded by the early peyote researcher Louis Lewin in his all-encompassing book Fantastic Narcotic and Stimulating Drugs, published in 1888. Quote, "Colored arabesques and figures appeared in endless play, geometrical forms of all kinds, spheres and cubes, changing rapidly triangles with yellow dots from which emanate gold and silver strings, radiant tapestries, carpets, filigree, lacework, and blue, brilliant red, green, blue, and yellow stripes, trees with light yellow blossoms, and many things besides." Once again, I want to emphasize not all of peyote experiences are as positive and fulfilling. Consumption of peyote and other hallucinogens without the guidance of a shaman or without being under the supervision of a trained guide can be quite horrifying and terrifying. Once again, as I've said in almost every episode of this podcast, always consume these substances under the watchful eye of a guide, ideally a shaman. When the Spaniards first encountered the indigenous peoples of Mexico in the 16th century, peyote was very much a part of the local culture, and there was an immediate confrontation on many fronts. The Spaniards were there looking for gold, to steal lands, to enslave the local people, and to force-feed them Western religion, essentially Catholicism, to replace all indigenous beliefs. Cody Johnson, the author of Magic Medicine, an excellent book on psychedelics, wrote, quote, "What the natives saw as the gateway to spirituality, the conquistadors condemned as a satanic drug scourge." The Spaniards viewed peyote as an obstacle in their efforts to civilize the indigenous peoples, which of course meant forcing them to convert to Catholicism. And because the indigenous beliefs were so deeply held and so vivid, since they were based on these mind-altering substances within the peyote cactus and the magic mushrooms, as we covered in Season 2, that the Spaniards did everything they could to eradicate the use of peyote and the mushrooms. Bernardo de Sahagún, one of the early chroniclers of this contact between the Mexican Aztecs and the Spaniards, wrote about peyote, quote, "Those who eat or drink it see visions, either frightful or mirthful, and then they say it sustains them and gives them courage to fight and not to feel hunger nor thirst, and say it protects them from all dangers." End of quote. The first full description of the living cactus was recorded by Dr. Francisco Hernandez, who was the personal physician to King Philip II of Spain. Hernandez was specifically sent to the New World to learn new medicines from indigenous Mexicans. Hernandez noted that peyote was employed medicinally in addition to its use as a psychedelic. Quote, "Ground up, peyote is applied to painful joints. It is said to give relief. Wonderful properties were attributed to this route. If any faith can be given to what is commonly said amongst the indigenous peoples, it causes those devouring it to be able to foresee and predict the future." The most traditional peyote ceremonies in Mexico today are held by three different groups: the Huichols, the Coras, and the Tarahumara. Schultes believe that their ceremonies had changed little in content over the centuries. In other words, their ceremonies are probably very similar to the way peyote was worshipped and consumed in pre-Columbian times. According to some anthropologists, the Huichols consider life as a holy trinity, the three parts consisting of the deer, which is their main sustenance, maize, that is corn, which is their main foodstuff, and peyote, which is their religious sacrament. The Huichols have become known around the world for their spectacular paintings inspired by their peyote visions. 25 years ago, a Mexican physician named Silviano Camberos, a dear friend of mine who passed away since then, was in a ceremony with the Huichols when one of the participants was stung by a scorpion. Silviano told me, in Mexico in the far south, where you have the rainforest, there are big and very scary-looking scorpions. Their stings are painful yet seldom lethal. However, the smaller desert scorpions, genus Centroroides, have a sting which can be deadly. Since Silviano was a physician, when he saw that his Huichol colleague had been stung by a scorpion, he stood up to get his medical bag so he could start treating the fellow, even though they were in the middle of this sacred ceremony. However, the roadman, that is the shaman, grabbed Silviano by the arm and said, quote, "He's under the influence and the protection of peyote. You don't need to administer any Western medicine." And indeed, the man was fine. One of the most famous shamans of the Huichol was a gentleman named Ramon Medina Silva. Some have suggested that it was Medina Silva who served as the inspiration for Carlos Castaneda's Don Juan, the archetypal shaman of Castaneda's best-selling novels of the 70s and 80s. Others have suggested it was Don Juan Matsua, another Huichol peyote master. Matsua left a great quote expressing his humility in the face of peyote's power and magic. Quote, "The shaman's path is an ending. I am an old, old man, and still a baby, standing before the mystery of the world." Castaneda wrote about the magic mushrooms being used by the Yaqui peoples, except the Yaquis live in the deserts of northern Mexico, where mushrooms do not grow. The mushrooms, in fact, thrive further south in a rainier and more humid environment, such as found in the states of Oaxaca and Chiapas. Many question whether Castaneda was ingesting hallucinogenic mushrooms in northern Mexico, when it seems much more likely that he was in fact consuming peyote there and working with groups like the Huichols, who were peyote masters, rather than the Yaquis, as he claimed. One of the most intriguing aspects of peyote is that it has been incorporated into a syncretic religion known as the Native American Church. The Native American Church began in the 1870s when the Kiowas, which were the first tribes studied by Schultes, and the Comanches learned of peyote from the tribes further south in Mexico, and they took the plant with them to Oklahoma, which is where Schultes studied it. The tribes established a whole new religion, which was a combination of Christianity, traditional beliefs, and peyote. The cult spread rapidly through the Southwest, up into the Great Plains as far north as Canada, incorporating in each case some aspect of the local culture and belief system. With over 250,000 members today, the Native American Church is the largest indigenous religion in the Americas. However, as the peyote religion first began to spread, it soon met resistance from missionaries and government officials. In an attempt to protect their religious rights, the Native Americans formally incorporated their movement into the Native American Church in 1918. It was officially recognized as a church, therefore a state religion, and protected by the Bill of Rights, even though opposition to peyote continued. I was always pleased to hear from Professor Schultes himself that he took great pride in having submitted testimony to the U.S. Congress in favor of the indigenous people's rights to their sacrament and their religion as early as the 1930s, and he and other scientists like Weston LaBarre, his original partner on his first peyote expedition, spoke out for years afterwards in favor of allowing these people to practice their belief system, saying it was a freedom of religion issue guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. In fact, when ayahuasca as a religious sacrament was challenged, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, I attended the session in Washington, D.C., and the argument was that these people who had been busted for ayahuasca claimed it was part of their religion. And both John Roberts and Antonin Scalia, two of the most conservative members of the Supreme Court, said, "This is a freedom of religion issue, the case is closed, and the people won the right to use ayahuasca as their sacrament." One thing you learn in the study of hallucinogens, psychedelics, and entheogens is that these compounds sometimes make for strange bedfellows. Another interesting aspect of the Native American Church is that their access to peyote was again challenged just a few decades ago, despite the fact it had been approved decades earlier by the Supreme Court. There was a brief filed by surprising allies who wanted to see this freedom of religion respected. Groups as different as Baptists, Catholics, Episcopalians, Mormons, that is LDS, the Latter-day Saints Church, Jews, Methodists, and Muslims, as well as the ACLU, all filed an amicus curiae, that is a friend of the court brief, in support of the indigenous peoples and their right to access their sacred plant. One of the most important figures in not only the history of psychedelics, but the history of indigenous peoples in North America was that of a Comanche war chief named Quanah Parker, who became a leading proponent of the Native American Church. Parker was a fascinating figure. He was the son of a Comanche war leader and a white woman, but the white woman had been kidnapped as a child and raised by the Comanches. So both Quanah Parker and his mother were fascinating characters, boundary walkers that straddled different worlds. Interestingly enough, when she was, quote, rescued by white people, she didn't want to be rescued and refused to leave her indigenous family and tribe. When she was forcibly resettled by the whites, she starved herself to death. This is important on many levels. Growing up in the American South, I was always taught that our culture and our way of life was superior to all others. But many years of working with indigenous peoples has taught me there are other ways of being and knowing. And if you look at history, case after case and time after time, whites who were captured by indigenous peoples often refused to return to white society. This happened repeatedly. It's in fact a major plot point in John Ford's classic Western, The Searchers, which is regarded by many as the greatest Western of all time. In the Amazon, I know of Caucasians who were adopted into indigenous tribes like the Kayapo. Numerous accounts of outsiders who seem to prefer the indigenous way are detailed in Sebastian Junger's book Tribes, and I highly recommend reading it. And to show the power of the Native American Church, there's a quote I dearly love. It says that the white man goes into his church, to talk about Jesus, but the Indian goes into his teepee, takes peyote, and talks to Jesus. This is often attributed to an anthropologist by the name of J.S. Slotkin, but my colleague Keeper Trout, who I mentioned earlier, believes that this quote actually came from Quanah Parker himself. Parker, as I said, had a foot in two worlds, and that his ability to straddle those cultures, not only being a war chief of the Comanche, but being a personal friend of President Theodore Roosevelt, exemplified this type of boundary walking. He was a powerful and effective spokesman for his people's right to practice their own religion and consume peyote, and to make sure that the whites and the rest of the outside world weren't able to make it illegal, despite repeated attempts to do so. So I think that the future, if we get it right, will not only not see the banning of psychedelic substances when used respectfully and under the right guidance and supervision, we're going to see hallucinogens become a part of many Western religions as well. And if you listen to earlier episodes of Plants of the Gods, I touched on this many times, that I believe many ethnobotanists believe increasingly, many spiritual leaders and historians believe increasingly, that some of these so-called great religions like Judaism and Christianity and others may have gotten their start in the use of mind-altering substances. Finally, a word about Aldous Huxley. As I mentioned, his book Doors of Perception quickly became a touchstone in the field of psychedelic literature. By introducing curious Westerners to mescaline and singing its praises through incredible descriptions, Huxley opened the doors of perception for generations of psychedelic explorers. So impactful was Huxley's influence that he is one of the cultural icons featured on the cover of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album. Note that Huxley took his title from the artist William Blake, a seminal figure in both poetry and the visual arts. Blake wrote, quote, "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through the narrow chunks of his cavern." And that is a point made over and over again by users and proponents and supporters of these mind-altering substances, that these psychedelics allow you to see and perceive things in a broad perspective that you simply cannot envision in a so-called normal state of mind. From Blake's inspiration of Huxley came Huxley's inspiration of Jim Morrison. Morrison was so taken by Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception, that he borrowed its title for his band, The Doors. So the torch of illumination was passed from William Blake to Aldous Huxley to Jim Morrison. The origin of all this was in May of 1953, when the British psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond spent a few days with Huxley at his home in Los Angeles. On May 4th, Huxley had his first experience with mescaline, and it exceeded his wildest expectation and changed his life forever. Huxley wrote of the experience, quote, "To be shaken out of the ruts of ordinary perception, to be shown for a few timeless hours the outer and inner world, not as they appear to an animal obsessed for survival, or to a human being obsessed with words and notions, but as they are apprehended directly and unconditionally by the mind at large. This is an experience of inestimable value to everyone." He went on to write, quote, "Without question, the most extraordinary and significant experience this side of the beatific vision. Looking at a flower arrangement in the room, he felt that he was, quote, seeing what Adam had seen on the morning of his creation, the miracle moment by moment of naked existence." Huxley became such a fervent believer in the power of psychedelics that on the day he was dying in 1963, he took LSD to ease the transition to another world. One particularly peculiar aspect of the science and study of peyote and mescaline that few people do not realize is that amphetamines are chemical analogs of mescaline. So, as I emphasize, these are plants that can heal and harm. Chemists study natural compounds like psilocybin or mescaline, and used them as inspirations to devise different versions with new effects. Remember that in Season 2, I described how LSD itself was created when Albert Hofmann was experimenting with the ergot alkaloids from the ergot fungus. When you think about, or when you hear about drugs like benzodrine or methadone or crystal meth, these are all based in a way on mescaline from this little cactus from the Mexico-Texas border. I don't believe many people realize that these amphetamines, which have caused so much harm and are so deleterious to your health in many instances and addictive in some cases, started out because of chemists playing with this odd natural compound extracted from the cactus. My colleague John Mann, the famous organic chemist who is best known as the author of Murder, Magic, and Medicine, wrote that these drugs also became popular in sports. Amphetamines were favored by cyclists who enjoyed the sudden and explosive push they got from taking the pills. These amphetamines provide a kick, and they're not only used by athletes, they became staples of the club scene. In fact, pilots in World War II used them for added endurance. The sporadic battles that flared up in the streets of Great Britain between the scooter-riding mods and the motorcycle-riding rockers, the mods versus rockers in the 1960s, which were the basis of the Who's classic album Quadrophenia in 1973, was supposed to have been fueled by amphetamines. In fact, one of the effects of cheap amphetamines is that you get hopped up and you start stuttering. If you remember the Who's very first hit, My Generation, talking about my generation, many believe that this was caused by band members taking amphetamines to be able to perform longer and deeper into the night. Finally, let me say that in an age where peyote is being vastly over-harvested by people seeking mind-altering experiences, it truly places the wild plant, this little slow-growing cactus, in danger. In the wild, a peyote cactus can take decades to reach full size. My pal Tim Ferriss, who wrote an excellent white paper on the conservation impact of harvesting and consuming hallucinogens, whether it's fungi, whether it's cacti, or whether it's frogs, has noted that we should try to steer away from substances whose consumption can cause the endangerment of a species.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please remember to give us a good rating and to subscribe and share with like-minded folks. We appreciate your support for the protection of the knowledge and biodiversity of South America by the Amazon Conservation Team. In our next episode, Mark will continue our discussion of the magic cactus as he discusses Richard Evans Schultes and the Peyote Road.